Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Floating World, a novel, by C. Morgan Babst, read by Christa Lewis. When the sun refused to shine, when the moon turns red with blood, when the winds begin to howl, on that hallelujah day, when the revolution comes, when our leaders learn to cry, when the saints go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in, how I want to be in that number, when the saints go marching in. Traditional. Each must be his own hope. Virgil, The Aeneid, Book 11. Part 1. The Sorrowing Houses. 47 days after landfall, October 15th. The house bobbed in a dark lake. The flood was gone, but Cora still felt it wrapped around her waist, its head nestled on her hip. She laid her hands out, palms on its surface, and the drifting hem of her nightshirt fingered her thighs. Under her feet lake bed slipped, pebbles and grit, mud broken into scales that curled up at their edges. Her legs dragged as she moved under the tilting crosses of the electrical poles, keeping her head tipped up, her mouth open. Her fingers trailed behind her, shirring the water that was air. Troy's bloated house reeked of flood. Dirt, mildew, algae, the smell of the dead. On the dusty siding, she traced the line of sediment that circled the house, high up where the water had come. Beside the door was the mark of the storm. 96 0 1D TF3. The broken concrete of the driveway seesawed, and the kitchen window was still open as she and Troy had left it when they came for the children. The shutters banged flat against the weatherboard. The little boy had jumped at her from the windowsill, naked except for a pair of water wings, a frenzy of brown and orange. She closed her eyes. Blot it out. But even in the dark, she could feel his head cupped in her hand. She could hear Raina screaming. She saw herself rocking in the pirogue in the thick air, the little boy nestled against her chest. The flood had floated them high. Now she got up and put one foot against the siding, two hands on the sill. She strained, scrambled, jumped. She hauled her body up and perched in the window, her muscles trembling. The moon cast Cora's shadow, long and black, across the kitchen floor, where a woman lay, her face no longer a face, only a mess of blackened blood. She shut her eyes. Blot it out. But when she looked again, Raina's body still lay curled, as if in sleep, around the shotgun that was missing from the house on Esplanade, her arm trailing awkwardly behind her, like something ripped apart by a strong wind. Blot it out, Mrs. Ransell had told her. So she had been sleeping. Drugs like a dark river to drown in. But now she felt again the gun recoil against her shoulder. Saw again the light of the blast in the high hall. Blot it out, but she could see, as clear as if it were happening again in front of her now, Troy standing above her at the top of the stairs, the little boy reaching out to stroke his mother's smooth, unmaddened brow. She saw Raina press her face against the window, her eyes plucked out by birds. Cora looked down from the window, and the pool of blood whirled through the woman's face, through the kitchen floor, pulling her under. The storm threw a barge against the flood wall. The surge dug out handfuls of sand. The gulf bent its head and rammed into the breach until it had tunneled through to air. The lowest pressure ever recorded, the radio voices said, and the vacuum pulled at her, her nightdress snapping against her body like a flag. Night poured in through the window. Stars streaked down through the sky. She would fall. She was falling. The flood's reek rose. Thursday, October 20th. Joe saw it only for an instant, the hawk perched on a peak of the Mississippi River Bridge. He had never seen a hawk before in the city, but now that the animals had returned, he saw them everywhere. Above all, the little creatures that scuffled and twittered, re-establishing their territories among the fallen pines. Raptors floated in an emptied sky. Joe looked in the rear view to be sure it was a hawk he'd seen and not a vulture or a crow. The mirror reflected only the X's of the steel arch. He might paint it anyway, he thought, the predator with her hooked beak, silhouetted against the river and the illusory sea. At the end of the bridge, he merged onto General de Gaulle, towards his father's nursing home. He had always hated this drive, the elevated highway over the big box stores and the Vietnamese places and the nothing, Tess would say. No, he should have corrected her, not the nothing, the houses. Now that the roofs below him were covered in the Crayola blue FEMA tarps, as if the city was drowning in a cartoon ocean, he hated it even more. But this was the final trip. The West Bank had seen the last of Joseph Boisdoré. He made his mouth smile. The physical state affects the mental, and vice versa, Tess had said, dragging Cora out of bed for a walk in the suburban sunshine of Houston. If you smile, you'll find yourself happier. Smile, and given time, even this knob of guilt might melt away. In the parking lot at the Little Sisters, Sister Cecilia was waiting for him. She was the picture of a nun. Short gray hair, a hank of keys clipped to her elastic waistband. Mother Superior, Tess liked to call her, though she was not.
"Sister, how good to see you."
He stuck out his hand, and she took it in both of hers.
"A rare pleasure, Mr. Boisdoré. How is your father?"
He nodded, maintained his smile, didn't say, "so much better now that he's back home."
"He's putterin'."
They had all been opposed when he suggested moving Vincent out to the cabin, but his father was better off alone with Joe, somewhere Tess couldn't interfere. Since they'd been home, Vincent had put a French polish on all the good furniture and oiled the rest. He'd been walking around in the felled trees. "So much old-growth pine. You'll let me buy it off you, $10 a cord?" Okay, it wasn't perfect, but the old man mostly knew where he was.
"People don't buy good things nowadays,"
he'd said, last night over red beans.
"Particle board crap. Comes flat in a box and you put it together yourself, with plastic pegs."
He was so well this morning, Joe had left him there alone.
"That's good to hear. We've had a lot of bad news."
Sister Cecilia led him in towards the emergency stairs. "Broken" was written big on masking tape across the elevator doors.
"Many who couldn't make the transition."
Joe nodded as she crumpled her skirt in her fingers, trouser sock above tennis shoe, and began to climb.
"I'm sure he's grateful to be getting Tess's cooking more often. He used to really go on about it. So much crab she put in the gumbo, how crispy was the chicken." "Actually, it's just us boys at the cabin, sister, for the time being."
Confession was a long habit.
"Tess is in the city, looking after our daughter Cora. She's not doing well."
Sister Cecilia's hand stopped on the railing, gripped it the way you grip a tool.
"I'm sorry to hear that."
She took another step.
"This has been hard on many married people. Hard on everyone. I hope you will find a way to reconcile." "Yes, sister."
He paused on the landing to catch his breath and looked up at her. It was amazing how much they understood, nuns, considering how little they had experienced, but hard was an understatement.
"I think we will. Tess just needs time to take it in." "And you do not need time."
Rembrandt could have painted her, the judgmental patience in her face. "Pop grew up in that cabin, you know," Joe said. "Been in the family since 1815. I do think the familiarity's doing him good." She nodded. "I will pray for you." They walked up the remaining floors in silence. He was breathing hard, otherwise he would have felt odd, being with somebody now without going over all of it. How did you make out? And I guess we always knew those levees weren't worth shit, and happened to know a tree man who can do a job quick. If it was late, if there'd been drinking, or even in the day, in a dimly lit hardware store with the doors jingle bells gone quiet, if it was just you and him, if there was trust, you might talk of other things. "Did you hear about the shooting on the Danziger? It was not an act of God. They pulled AKs on me in my own goddamned house. It was not a natural disaster. You think they might have blown the levees, like they did in 27? It was man-made. You think a one of them is going to be called to account? An act of man." The battery-lit stairwell was a column of heat, and sweat ran down his chest, but Joe reminded himself to smile. Otherwise his chest might start burning. Smile if you want to feel happy. Move if you need to feel strength. On the 9th floor, Sister Cecilia waited. She was breathing lightly through her nose. "You're in great shape, Sister," he said as he huffed up the last steps. "Last spring, some of us gave up the elevators for Lent." A smile flickered on her mouth. "I kept it up for the sake of my heart, but now I wonder if the Lord was not preparing us." When they came out onto the floor where his father had lived for 5 years, wheelchairs were stalled at odd angles in the hallway, and a humid murk of urine, mildew, and microwaved food hung in the air. Sister Cecilia's Reeboks squeaked on the linoleum. They turned beside the nurse's station, where a beach scene in paper ribbon still hung above the filing cabinets. Construction paper sun, corrugated sea. The door to the room across from it was open. Inside, Joe saw the usual plastic-wrapped mattress, the vacant stare of a television screen. Now, though, a pane of the window was cracked, the glass split but still together, as though someone had tried and failed to escape. At the end of the hall, Sister Cecilia was weighing the two ends of her keychain in her hands, her straight form in bloomy cotton backlit by the window. "Sorry." As he lifted his hand from the arm of a wheelchair, blue imitation leather flaked off in his palm. Somehow he hadn't expected that the room would be just the same. Laundry overflowing the hamper, slippers stepped out of beside the bed. Damage was normal now. The bathtub ring around the city, the misplaced houses and overturned cars, their home on Esplanade wallpapered in mold, a magnolia tree in the kitchen, his unfinished sculptures of dogs and children hanging in the dying branches, their furniture all crammed into the Doby's house, their boxes in the storage barn. He and Tess were not speaking to each other, and Cora was not speaking at all. The thoroughness of the destruction almost kept you from remembering what had been destroyed. But here, the remote was hidden in the Barcalounger. The ceramic pheasants, dull with dust, roosted on the windowsill. A photograph of his mother in her wedding dress stood on the bedside table, her dress gone as sepia as her skin. "Smile," he told himself. He breathed through his teeth. In his pocket, his phone rang. It was Saul, the overseer of the farm behind them. He looked at Sister Cecilia, stationed in the corner, and took the call. "Hey, Joe." "Yeah?" "You aware your dad's out walking along Lee Road? I pulled over to see if y'all was in trouble, if he need any help, but he just waved me on." The muscles between Joe's ribs seized up, and he bent over as if just to grab his father's pajamas from the foot of the bed. "You're in over your head," Tess had said.
"He seemed all right, to be fair. Said he was out looking for the dog got loose."
"We don't have a dog."
"Well, shit. I couldn't recollect if you did or you didn't."
"Can you try again?"
"Would if I could, Joe, but I've been 20 minutes driving before I could get any signal, and now I'm at the feed store. You ain't off somewhere, are you? Tess at the house, maybe?"
"No."
"Well, damn. If I'd have known you had errands to run, hell, I coulda."
Joe bowed his head down over the folded red blanket his mother had crocheted. He pressed the end button with his thumb and held his breath, his feet still on the floor.
"Are you all right, Mr. Boisdoré?"
Sister Cecilia laid her hand on his back, but he only pressed his cheek against the blanket's weave, breathing in the wet sheep and woolite, trying not to see his father standing on the shoulder, waiting for a break in the traffic. People sped on Lee Road, roaring around the blind corners. He could hear the whip of the wind against the gateposts and the trees. He shook his head against the blanket, dug his nails into the wool. He tried to remember his mother's hands, index finger wrapping the yarn around the hook pulling through the chain. If only life followed that regular, smooth rhythm, time falling into your lap in a well-knotted braid, but instead there were always snags, holes, cut strands of yarn that, if pulled, could unravel the whole thing. There was no pattern for peace. His chest still burned. Today, Tess told herself, they would make it to the hedge. The Confederate jasmine that Laura Doby had trained along her iron fence had begun to insinuate itself into the boxwoods, and ripping it out was the least they could do. "The least we can do," Tess told Cora, "considering the Dobys are lending us their house." The main objective, of course, was just to get Cora out of bed, but Dan Doby really had been so sweet. The way he'd just thrown his house keys at her through the car window as he and Laura headed out of town. "Keeping their house from falling down in their absence is really the very least we can do," Tess said, petting her daughter's arm, and Cora slid her skeletal legs off the mattress of her childhood bed, let her feet fall on the padded floor of Dan's home gym. Cora then stood up under her own power and walked, her bony knees trembling, all the way to the hall door. Cora's nightgown was half tucked into the seat of her underpants, but Tess had not made a move to fix it, worried that that would break the spell. Her daughter was on her arm now. They were descending the stairs. Tess held on to the banister, feeling a bit unsteady herself. She saw how one might think neurosis could be catching. They used to joke about it in the office. "I think you've caught Verlander's kleptomania, Alice." But emotional contagion was a real thing, at least according to Hatfield. Since moving alone with Cora into the Doby's house, Tess had had to fight not only against the ubiquitous grief, but against the urge to sink into the mattress and disappear, as Cora was trying so desperately to do. Tess had to remind herself that Cora had experienced a direct trauma, had seen the storm with her own eyes, had been out in the flood in a pirogue, and to top it off, had had the tremendous bad luck to rescue Mrs. Ransell, only to watch her die of a stroke just 1 week after they'd finally made it to Houston. Still, when Tess tried to be happy that Dell was coming today, that in a few hours her healthy daughter would be here with her feet up on the Doby's coffee table, helping her drink a bottle of Chardonnay, she only felt exhausted. For now, though, she and Cora were going down the stairs. They took one at a time, Cora staring hard at her toes. Her feet were dirty again, God knew why. Again her dinner tray had not been touched. Again she smelled oddly of river mud. But they reached the bottom of the stairs without incident. Tess told herself that this was progress. When she tugged her daughter's nightgown free, so that it fell over her legs in a muslin cloud, however, Cora stopped short in the middle of the foyer, and as Tess had feared, refused to budge. Yesterday, though, they'd gotten as far as the front porch. Today, they would make it to the hedge. "Cora, come on now," Tess said, her hand calm in her daughter's hand. "Your sister's coming today. We need to make things pretty for her." Cora didn't move. "We can't let Dell see how we've been letting ourselves go, can we?" she asked, offering Cora a chance to agree. "Won't it be nice to just work a little while in the fresh air?" "Fresh," Cora said, her face full of stubborn sleep, like the face of an awakened child. She shook her head slowly. "No." Tess could admit that she would have liked to stay in bed. The world outside was hot and sour, and it was nice to take refuge in the air conditioning among the old mahogany furniture she and Joe had rescued from their house on Esplanade. The curtained rooms were quiet, and Laura's ugly high-pile carpets were so soft beneath your feet. But you couldn't just sleep. Already Tess had cleaned the Dobies' kitchen cabinets with Murphy's oil, washed the mustiness out of all of the sheets, polished the Marleybone silver that had traveled with her to Houston and back again. You couldn't sleep. She had been telling Cora this since Houston, even as she handed over the Ambien. You couldn't just sleep until it was over, even if you were drained beyond your last drop, reamed out like a lemon down to the pith. You couldn't just sleep, even if that was the only thing that felt good. Even if, alone on the Dobies' nice pillow-topped mattress, Joe not in it, Tess slept like a baby. Every morning now she woke up clutching her pillow, sprawled out and drooling. But she got herself out of bed. "Come on now." She reached out her two hands, remained upright, cheerful. Project the affect you would like to see echoed in the patient. "It's like cold storage in here." Tess turned and opened the front door, let a rectangle of yellow sun swoon across the barge boards, but Cora backed away. "Cora," Tess said in the same calm, conspiring voice. Cora's eyes, ringed in dark circles like the city's flooded houses, were blank. "Cora," she said again, more forcefully now. But Cora just stared straight ahead, as though she knew no one by that name. "Sheba!" Vincent put his foot down between the logs, hollered. "Sheba! God damn it, you come!" Heat dripped down the insides of his thighs like urine, and a smell of waste rose up out of the knocked-down trees. A hamster cage rot wood smell, not like the sharp, clear smell of sanding and saws, like trash, like a bedpan tipped over, soiling the sheets, like the dog dead, flies clustered on her eyelids. "Sheba!" Out over the forest, something had come. He licked his finger, held it into the air. No wind, but something had come and knocked it all down. Must have been how the dog got loose. Didn't like thunder, that dog. Went to ground if you didn't let her in the bathtub. He marched out into the forest. A few steps was all it took to put him out of breath, but still he couldn't hear the road behind him anymore. He looked over his shoulder. Couldn't see the road. "Mr. Vincent, where you headed?" Some old redneck pulled up off the shoulder in his dually, thinks he's a big man. "You sure you should be out here by yourself?" Like he was some pickaninny needed scolding. Damn him if the Boisdorés hadn't owned this tract for almost as long back as there'd been men here of that name. The name had belonged first to white men, of course. Frenchmen you didn't call bigamists, even if that's what they were, who passed it on to the children of colored women, who were neither wives nor whores. Adelaide was the only name she had, but then her grandson was Boisdoré, or so it was written on the deed to these 180 acres when it was
given to him in exchange for his service in the 1812 war, though landowning and even so great a parcel did not convey the rest of what it should have: personhood, a vote. And now even the trees had been knocked down. Vincent squinted to see how far this all went, whether tornado or hurricane. Far. Out in the distance, scavengers circled in the air. They had found her near to the edge of the property, Sheba. Flies encrusted in the grayed fur around her eyes. A shameful thing to have forgotten, and then for him to go calling in the woods for a dead dog like a fool. Pop, they say it's dementia, nothing to be ashamed of. Damn them if it was nothing to be ashamed of, a grown man wetting his pants. And the dog was under the soil these 25 years, under a stone angel Sylvia had bought her, had her name carved in it, and those narrow dates like a tragic child, except she'd been an old dog when she died. He'd picked her up in his arms, and felt all those lumps the veterinarian said were benign, brushed her face clean, almost laughed at the dirt on her, paws clay-red from digging, dug till her heart had stopped. She must have been hunting. Moles, maybe it was, though in all his life he'd never seen a mole. But that dog always went out with a purpose, her nose to the ground, flung back the mud with quick claws, shovel-foot. You wanted her to dig post holes for you, but she had her own ideas. They all had their own ideas, comes down to it. Your purposes were never good enough for them. Build a business and watch them turn up their noses. Build a home and watch them run away, to Texas, to Esplanade Avenue, with some white girl's money. Nothing you ever did was good enough, not even the cabin, which his father said by most to be the finest cabinet-maker in the South since the Butterfly Man had built by hand, each board cut to notch into the next, so that there wasn't a nail in the whole house they hadn't hung a picture on. But it wasn't good enough. Not for Joe under Tess's thumb, not even the sleeping porch, the pleasantest place to spend a night. A little breeze and the fireflies blinking was good enough. No, they'd torn it off and built a 2-story camelback addition that looked like it had fallen from the sky, like one of those L-shaped bricks on the kids' Nintendo game. He wanted sometimes to turn off the water and lead them by candle to the outhouse, show them what for centuries had been just fine. Vincent covered the sun with his hand, and looked out again to where the vultures or buzzards or what have you were wheeling around the dead pecan, like they were tied to it by strings. The scavengers liked the dead tree, was why they'd left it up. He contended it was edifying, to remember what we built ourselves out of, what we meant to. Not dust so much as flesh, flesh to flesh. Sylvia hadn't liked hearing it. She believed in transcendence, the way Joe did with his art, his higher purpose, as he'd shouted once, mad as hell. According to them, there was something surpassed the material, a soul, some swishy stuff that wormed around in the air. He didn't have much talent for religious feeling, though he went to church regular, even now that Sylvia was gone. What's an hour every Sunday and a few fish dinners compared to even the slimmest possibility of an eternity in paradise, she'd say. He'd never had a problem with her fish dinners, no matter what day it was, but transcendence was not something he had much truck with. He liked making things you could sleep on, sit in, things that had function. And it comforted him to know he would be recycled, as the kids would put it, become a buzzard, even a little worm. He could blink and be there and hardly know the difference the way his mind was going. Blink, and you're tunneling through the darkness, the mud cool and soft on your sides. Blink, and you're afloat on a cushion of air, scanning for death on the weather-beaten ground. The plane tilted low over Kenner, too low, so that Dell could read the names on the buildings, see the dogs, boxes, lumber riding in the beds of trucks. The white guy in the middle seat leaned over her and peered out. He'd been gone since the storm, probably, like a lot of the rest of them who had congregated around the podium at LaGuardia, introducing themselves, talking like it was some kind of family reunion. Dell looked away.
She'd chosen the window seat as she had ever since she'd gone away to college 8 years ago. She'd liked looking out of the plane window at the bridges over the lake, the highway over the swamp.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?